Have you ever been invisible for so long that being chosen feels like a shock to your entire system? Maybe you're from a place where people like you learn early that staying unnoticed is safer than standing out. If you've ever felt that way, you'll understand exactly what happened to Zara Williams on the day everything changed. Zara had perfected the art of being invisible over the past 18 months, working as live-in staff for the Torino family. At 24, she moved through their sprawling Lincoln Park mansion like a whisper, appearing when needed and vanishing the moment her tasks were complete. She knew exactly how long it took to dust the mahogany banister without being noticed by Vincent Torino during his morning coffee. She knew which floorboards creaked and how to avoid them when 80-year-old Sophia had nightmares. She knew that Mrs. Torino Sr. preferred her presence acknowledged with a brief nod rather than words, and that the other staff members treated her with the polite distance reserved for someone who clearly didn't belong in their established hierarchy. The Torino mansion was a study in understated power, all dark wood and Italian marble that whispered old money even as it showcased new wealth. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Lake Michigan, and every piece of furniture was positioned with the kind of precision that suggested someone who controlled every detail of his environment. Zara had learned to appreciate the beauty while remembering she was only borrowing space in it. She hadn't planned to become a maid. 3 years ago, she'd been a junior at Northwestern University, double majoring in international studies and linguistics, dreaming of working for the State Department or maybe the United Nations. Her scholarship covered tuition, and her part-time job at the campus library covered books and basic expenses. Life had been manageable, predictable, heading toward everything she'd worked for since high school. Then her mother's cancer diagnosis changed everything overnight. Stage 3 breast cancer meant aggressive treatment, and aggressive treatment meant someone needed to be available for the endless cycle of chemotherapy appointments, doctor visits, and the days when the medication left her too weak to get out of bed. Zara's father had walked out when she was 7, leaving behind only child support payments that stopped the day she turned 18. Her mother had raised her alone, working double shifts as a nurse to give Zara opportunities she'd never had. When the roles reversed, there hadn't been a choice to make. Dropping out of college had felt like watching her future dissolve, but finding work that paid enough to cover her mother's medical bills and their rent had been even harder. The Torino family's job posting had appeared on a domestic employment website like an answer to prayers she'd been too proud to voice. Live-in position, excellent salary, private room and board, and most importantly, flexible scheduling that would allow her to care for her mother during her recovery. Vincent Torino had interviewed her himself, which had surprised everyone, including the hiring agency. Most wealthy families delegated staff hiring to housekeepers or personal assistants, but he'd insisted on meeting her personally. She'd expected someone intimidating, maybe cruel, definitely dismissive. Instead, she'd found a man who asked thoughtful questions about her background, listened carefully to her answers, and seemed genuinely concerned about whether the position would work for both parties. She'd known the Torino name carried weight in Chicago, knew there were whispers about the nature of Vincent's business interests, but the salary was more than double what she'd earned anywhere else. And her mother needed those expensive medications more than Zara needed moral certainty about her employer's activities. Some choices weren't really choices at all. Vincent Torino was nothing like what she'd expected from a man with his reputation. At 34, he moved with the kind of controlled grace that suggested someone comfortable with power, but his interactions with his daughter were gentle, patient, completely at odds with the rumors that followed his name. He was tall, probably 6 foot, with the kind of presence that commanded attention even when he was trying to be casual. His dark hair was always perfectly styled, his clothes expensive but never flashy, and his green-gray eyes missed nothing. She'd learned to read his moods from the set of his shoulders and the way his jaw tensed when business calls interrupted family time. Sophia Torino was the unexpected heart of the household. 8 years old with her father's eyes and her late mother's delicate features, she was the kind of child who noticed everything and felt everything deeply. Her mother had died in a car accident 2 years earlier, and Sophia still had nightmares most weeks. The other staff members were kind but busy, treating her with the careful politeness adults used with grieving children they didn't quite know how to comfort. Zara had connected with her immediately, maybe because they were both a little lost in the big house, Maybe because Zara remembered being 8 and scared and needing someone to really listen. Their friendship had developed naturally over shared meals in the kitchen and quiet moments when Sophia needed help with homework. Zara spoke 4 languages fluently, a remnant from her college studies, and Sophia was fascinated by the different ways to say the same thing. They'd started with simple Italian phrases, moved on to Spanish songs, and somehow developed their own tradition of reading together in Sophia's room when the nightmares made sleep impossible. Vincent noticed everything, and Zara had caught him watching these interactions with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. Not disapproval, exactly, but something intense and considering that made her hyper-aware of overstepping boundaries. She was staff, not family, and maintaining that distinction was important for everyone involved. That distinction became irrelevant on a Tuesday morning in March when Sophia changed everything with 7 simple words. Vincent was sitting at the kitchen island reviewing papers while Sophia finished her breakfast, both of them comfortable in the kind of routine that develops in single-parent households. Zara was refilling his coffee cup when Sophia looked up from her cereal with the serious expression she wore when she'd been thinking about something important. "I want Zara to come to Italy with us," she announced with the confidence of a child who'd never doubted that her wants mattered. Vincent's head snapped up from his documents, those green-gray eyes shifting between his daughter and Zara with something that might have been surprise or irritation or both. Zara felt her stomach drop somewhere around her feet, the coffee pot suddenly weighing 1,000 pounds in her hands. "Sophia," Vincent said carefully, his voice carrying that patient tone parents used when they needed to correct their children without embarrassing them. "This is family time. The trip to Sicily is just for us." "But I want her to come," Sophia insisted, her lower lip jutting out in the stubborn expression that meant she'd already decided and wasn't planning to change her mind. "She's the only one who listens to my stories about Mama, and she makes me feel safe when I have bad dreams. She speaks Italian better than you do, and she knows how to braid my hair the way Mama used to." Each word hit Zara like a physical blow, not because they were wrong, but because they were completely, devastatingly right. She had become essential to this child in ways she'd tried to keep professional, tried to maintain appropriate boundaries around, tried not to let matter too much. Sophia's innocent honesty was exposing feelings Zara had been careful not to examine too closely. Vincent was staring at her now with an expression she'd never seen before, something intense and searching that made her want to disappear into the expensive marble flooring. She could see him processing his daughter's words, recognizing truths he might not have noticed about how much time Sophia spent with her, how much comfort she found in Zara's presence. "Sophia," Zara said gently, setting down the coffee pot with hands that trembled slightly, "your father planned this trip for the 2 of you. It's important family time in your mama's homeland, and I wouldn't want to intrude on something so special." "You're not intruding if I invite you," Sophia said with the relentless logic of childhood. "And Papa said we could bring whatever would make me feel safe and happy. You make me feel safe and happy." The silence that followed was deafening. Zara could hear her own heartbeat, could feel Vincent's eyes still fixed on her face with that unreadable intensity. She knew exactly what she should say, how she should gracefully decline and redirect Sophia's attention to all the wonderful things she'd do with just her father. She knew the boundaries, understood her place, recognized that accepting would cross lines that couldn't be uncrossed. She also knew that Sophia rarely asked for anything, that the little girl still woke up crying for her mother most nights, that Vincent worried constantly about whether he was enough to help his daughter heal from a loss that had shattered both their worlds. The trip to Sicily wasn't just a vacation. Vincent had mentioned it several times over the past month, explaining to Sophia that they'd visit her grandmother Isabella, see the house where her mother had grown up, maybe help Sophia understand more about the woman she was forgetting in small ways every day. It was therapeutic, necessary, and absolutely none of Zara's business. "I appreciate that Sophia feels comfortable with me," Zara said finally, choosing her words carefully, "but this is a family trip, and I'm not family." Vincent studied her for a long moment, those green-gray eyes seeming to weigh something she couldn't identify. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than usual, more thoughtful. "Sophia doesn't ask for much," he said, not quite to Zara, but not exactly to his daughter either. "And she's right about feeling safe. If having you there would help her connect with her mother's heritage without being overwhelmed by grief, maybe we should consider it. Zara's breath caught in her throat. She'd expected him to support her graceful decline, to help his daughter understand appropriate boundaries. She hadn't expected him to seriously consider dragging his employee along on what should be an intimate family experience. Mr. Torino, she started, but Sophia was already bouncing in her chair with excitement. Really, Papa? Really, she can come? And we can practice Italian together on the airplane, and she can meet Nana Isabella, and maybe she can help me be brave about visiting Mama's old room. The hope in Sophia's voice was heartbreaking. The kind of tentative joy that children displayed when they'd learned not to expect too much, but couldn't help wanting anyway. Zara looked at Vincent and saw something shift in his expression, the moment when his daughter's happiness became more important than conventional boundaries. "We'll need to discuss the logistics," he said, his gaze moving between Sophia and Zara with careful consideration. "This would be a working arrangement, not a vacation. Sophia's care and comfort would be your primary responsibility." Zara's mind was spinning, trying to process the reality of what he was suggesting. A month in Sicily with the Torino family, living in close quarters with Vincent, and navigating family dynamics she couldn't begin to understand. It was professionally inappropriate, personally dangerous, and absolutely not something she should agree to. It would also help Sophia, and Zara had discovered over the past 18 months that she would do almost anything to help Sophia. "If you're sure it would be beneficial for Sophia," she said carefully, "then I'd be honored to help however I can." Sophia's squeal of delight was probably audible from the street, and her enthusiastic hug nearly knocked Zara off balance. Over the little girl's head, Zara met Vincent's eyes and saw something there she couldn't identify, something intense and complicated that made her stomach flutter in ways that had nothing to do with nervousness about appropriate boundaries. "This changes everything," his expression seemed to say, and Zara had the unsettling feeling he was absolutely right. The private jet was a study in understated luxury that made Zara's chest tighten with anxiety. Cream leather seats that probably cost more than she'd made in 6 months, polished wood accents that gleamed under soft lighting, and enough space to hold a small dinner party. She'd flown exactly 3 times in her life, all on cramped commercial flights with crying babies and overpriced snacks, and this felt like stepping into someone else's life entirely. Zara had chosen the seat farthest from Vincent while still being close enough to Sophia if needed, a careful calculation that she hoped would maintain appropriate boundaries while fulfilling her responsibilities. She'd brought a book, thinking she could disappear into familiar words while they traveled, but her eyes kept drifting to Vincent as he worked on his laptop with a kind of focused intensity that suggested important decisions were being made. He'd changed from his usual business attire into dark jeans and a charcoal sweater that somehow made him look both more approachable and more dangerously attractive. The casual clothes revealed details she'd trained herself not to notice in the formal distance of their employer-employee relationship. The way the sweater stretched across his broad shoulders when he reached for his coffee. The strong hands that moved with surprising grace across the keyboard. The way his jaw tensed slightly when he was concentrating, creating a small line between his dark eyebrows. "Stop it," she told herself firmly. "He's your boss. This is a working arrangement, and you're here for Sophia, not to catalog the way expensive cashmere fits across Vincent Torino's chest." Sophia had been vibrating with excitement during takeoff, chattering about everything she wanted to show Zara in Sicily, but the steady hum of the engines and the comfortable warmth of the cabin had gradually made her eyelids heavy. She was curled up now in the seat next to Zara, fast asleep with her head pillowed on Zara's sweater, one small hand still clutching the Italian phrase book they'd been practicing from. The sight of Sophia sleeping peacefully for once, without the tension that usually marked her rest, did something strange to Zara's heart. Over the past 18 months, she'd watched this little girl struggle with grief that was too big for her small body, nightmares that stole her sleep, and the desperate need to hold on to memories of a mother she was slowly forgetting. Seeing her relaxed and happy, even if it was temporary, felt like a gift Zara hadn't known she needed. "You're good with her," Vincent said quietly, and Zara's head snapped up to find him watching them with an expression she couldn't quite read. His laptop was closed now, his full attention focused on her in a way that made her suddenly aware of how intimate this felt, the three of them alone together in this small, luxurious space above the clouds. She's easy to be good with, Zara replied softly, careful not to wake Sophia. She's incredibly bright and thoughtful. Most adults could learn something from the way she processes complex emotions. Vincent was quiet for a moment, his green-gray eyes studying Sophia's sleeping face with the kind of fierce love that made Zara's throat tighten unexpectedly. When he spoke again, his voice carried weight that suggested he rarely shared these thoughts with anyone. Her mother was like that, he said. Maria could find something beautiful or meaningful in almost any situation, even difficult ones. She had this way of making people feel seen, really seen, not just noticed. Sophia inherited that gift, but she's been too sad to use it much since the accident. Zara felt something shift in her chest at the pain in his voice. The careful way he spoke about his late wife that suggested the wound was still raw even after 2 years. She'd seen photos of Maria Torino around the house, a petite woman with Sophia's delicate features and warm brown eyes, always smiling in the pictures like someone who'd found joy easily. She talks about her sometimes, Zara said carefully, unsure whether this was information he wanted to hear. Usually when we're reading together or when she's helping me with something in the kitchen. Little memories, like how her mama used to sing to her in Italian or the way she braided Sophia's hair before school. Vincent's expression tightened slightly, and Zara worried she'd overstepped, shared something too personal that wasn't hers to share. But when he spoke, his voice was grateful rather than upset. She doesn't talk to me about Maria very much anymore, he admitted. I think she's trying to protect me from her sadness, which breaks my heart because she shouldn't have to protect anyone at 8 years old. The fact that she feels safe enough with you to share those memories means more than you probably realize. The honesty in his voice caught Zara off guard. This wasn't the careful politeness of an employer discussing his child's care with staff. This was a father sharing his fears with someone he trusted, and the realization sent warmth spreading through her chest in ways that had nothing to do with professional pride. She's lucky to have you, Zara said, meaning every word. I see how hard you work to make her feel safe and loved. Losing her mother was devastating, but having a father who puts her healing first is why she's as strong as she is. Vincent studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression that made the air between them feel charged with possibility. Zara became hyper-aware of everything about this moment. The soft hum of the engines, the way afternoon sunlight streamed through the small windows, the fact that Sophia's peaceful breathing was the only sound interrupting the growing tension between them. What about you? He asked finally. Sophia mentioned that you take care of your mother. That can't be easy while working full-time. Zara felt her careful boundaries wavering under his genuine interest. She'd trained herself not to share personal details with the family, to keep her life outside the Torino mansion private and separate. But something about the way he'd opened up about Maria, the vulnerability in his voice when he talked about Sophia's grief, made her want to return that trust. My mother is doing well now, she said, her voice softer than she'd intended. The treatment was successful, and she's been cancer-free for 8 months. But the medical bills were significant, and she's still rebuilding her strength. The position with your family made it possible for me to help her without compromising her care. Vincent nodded, his expression thoughtful rather than pitying, which she appreciated more than he probably knew. Too many people heard about medical struggles and responded with sympathy that felt more like obligation than genuine concern. That must have been terrifying, he said simply, having someone you love facing something you can't control or fix. It was, Zara admitted, surprised by how much relief she felt at having someone understand that particular fear. You feel helpless, angry at the universe, desperate to do something meaningful when the only thing that really helps is time and treatment and hope. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but it was charged with something Zara couldn't name. Vincent was looking at her like he was seeing her clearly for the first time, not as Sophia's caregiver or household staff, but as a woman who'd made difficult choices and carried heavy responsibilities with grace. The captain's voice over the intercom broke the moment, announcing their descent into Catania, and Zara was grateful for the interruption before she could say something that would make their new dynamic even more complicated than it already was. Sophia stirred as the plane began its descent, blinking sleepily at Zara before sitting up with renewed excitement. We're almost there? Can I see out the window? Will Nana Isabella be waiting for us? Vincent shifted back into father mode seamlessly, helping Sophia with her seatbelt and pointing out landmarks as Sicily appeared below them. But Zara caught him glancing at her several times during the landing process. Each look felt deliberate, considering, like he was processing their conversation and what it meant for the dynamic between them. The Torino family estate was nothing like what Zara had expected. Instead of ostentatious displays of wealth, she found herself looking at an ancient villa that seemed to grow out of the Sicilian landscape itself. Honey-colored stone walls weathered by centuries of Mediterranean sun, terraced gardens that cascaded down toward the sparkling sea, and olive groves that stretched toward distant mountains. It was beautiful in a way that felt organic rather than designed, like generations of the same family had loved this place into its current form. Isabella Torino was waiting in the curved driveway, a small, elegant woman in her late 60s with silver hair styled in a perfect chignon and sharp dark eyes that missed nothing. She embraced Vincent with obvious joy, speaking rapid Italian that Sophia answered with delighted laughter, but her gaze kept drifting to Zara with something that felt like assessment rather than welcome. "Vincent," she said in accented English, switching languages with the smooth practice of someone who'd spent decades moving between cultures, "you didn't mention bringing a guest." There was nothing overtly rude in her tone, but Zara caught the subtle emphasis on the word guest that suggested Isabella knew exactly who she was and wasn't entirely pleased about her presence. Vincent's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, the kind of micro-reaction Zara had learned to read during her months in his household. "Nana, this is Zara," Sophia said with the innocent directness of childhood. "She's here because I asked Papa to bring her. She takes care of me when I have bad dreams, and she speaks Italian almost as well as you do." Isabella's smile for Sophia was warm and genuine, but when her eyes shifted to Zara, the temperature dropped several degrees. "How lovely that Sophia has found such dedicated help," she said, the word help carrying just enough emphasis to establish exactly where she thought Zara belonged in the family hierarchy. Vincent stepped closer to Zara, his movement subtle but unmistakably protective in a way that sent heat racing down her spine. "Zara isn't help, Mama," he said, his voice carrying quiet authority that brooked no argument. "She's here as Sophia's companion and friend. I trust you'll treat her with the respect due to any guest in our family's home." The silence that followed was deafening. Zara could feel the weight of unspoken history, family dynamics she couldn't begin to understand, and the sharp awareness that Vincent had just drawn a line in the sand on her behalf. Isabella's eyes narrowed slightly, but she inclined her head in acknowledgement of her son's wishes. "Of course," she said smoothly. "Any friend of Sophia's is welcome here. I've prepared the rose suite for your companion, Vincent. It has a lovely view of the gardens and is quite close to Sophia's room." Zara felt her breath catch. The rose suite sounded like guest accommodations, not staff quarters, and the significance of that distinction wasn't lost on anyone present. Vincent had positioned her as family friend rather than employee, which was both generous and dangerous in ways she was only beginning to understand. That evening, after Sophia had been fed, bathed, and settled into her childhood bedroom with its faded frescoes and antique furniture, Zara found herself in surroundings that felt like a luxury hotel rather than servant accommodation. The Rose Suite was spacious and elegant, with French doors that opened onto a balcony overlooking the Mediterranean. The bed was massive, draped in silk that probably cost more than her monthly salary, and fresh flowers had been arranged on the antique writing desk. She was unpacking her modest wardrobe into the enormous armoire when she heard Sophia crying from the next room. The sound was muffled, like the little girl was trying to keep her distress private, but Zara had learned to distinguish between Sophia's different types of tears. This was the hopeless sobbing that usually meant nightmares about the car accident that had taken her mother. Zara didn't hesitate. She crossed the hallway in her pajamas and knocked gently on Sophia's door, waiting for permission before entering. Sophia was sitting up in bed, tears streaming down her face as she clutched a worn stuffed elephant that had belonged to her mother. "Bad dream?" Zara asked softly, settling on the edge of the bed and opening her arms. Sophia crawled into her lap immediately, burying her face against Zara's shoulder with the desperate need of a child who'd learned that comfort wasn't guaranteed. I dreamed that Mama couldn't find me, Sophia whispered against her neck. I was calling for her, but she couldn't hear me, and I was so scared and alone. Zara's heart broke a little more for this brave little girl who carried such enormous grief in her small body. She held Sophia close, rocking gently while she whispered soft reassurances in Italian, the language Sophia associated with her mother's love. Your mama isn't lost, sweetheart, Zara murmured. She's in your heart, in every story you remember about her, in the way you laugh exactly like she did. Love like that doesn't disappear, it just changes form. They sat together in the soft lamplight, Sophia's breathing gradually returning to normal as Zara hummed an Italian lullaby she'd learned from a linguistics professor who'd insisted that music was the best way to understand a language's emotional rhythm. Sophia was almost asleep again when Zara became aware they weren't alone. Vincent was standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable as he watched them together. He was wearing dark pajama pants and a white t-shirt that revealed more of his physique than Zara was prepared to handle, but it was the look in his eyes that made her breath catch. Raw gratitude mixed with something deeper, something that made her hyper-aware of how intimate this scene must appear to him. She gives you peace, doesn't she? He said quietly, speaking to Sophia, but looking at Zara with an intensity that made her heart race. Sophia nodded against Zara's shoulder. She makes the scared feelings go away, she whispered. Like Mama used to do. Vincent's expression tightened with emotion, and Zara saw the moment he realized what she'd given his daughter, what he'd been unable to provide despite all his love and devotion. The recognition in his eyes was complicated, grateful, but also vulnerable in a way that suggested he was seeing her as something far more significant than Sophia's caregiver. Thank you, he said simply, but the weight behind those two words suggested he was thanking her for much more than this one moment of comfort. Zara settled Sophia back into bed, tucking the covers around her small body and promising to leave her door open so she could call if she needed anything. When she turned to leave, Vincent was still watching from the doorway, and the hallway suddenly felt too small to contain both of them, and the growing awareness that something fundamental had shifted between them. She's lucky to have you, Zara said softly as she passed him, unconsciously echoing his earlier words on the plane. Vincent caught her arm gently, his touch sending electricity racing across her skin. We both are, he said, his voice rough with emotion that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the way he was looking at her like she was something precious he'd unexpectedly found. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility and dangerous with implications neither of them was ready to examine. Then Vincent stepped back, giving her space to escape to her own room, but the heat in his eyes suggested this conversation was far from over. Lying in the enormous bed an hour later, listening to the gentle sound of waves against distant cliffs, Zara stared at the ceiling and tried to process everything that had changed in less than 24 hours. She'd come to Sicily as Sophia's caregiver, but Vincent was looking at her like a woman he desired, and Isabella was treating her like a threat to be managed. Whatever professional boundaries she'd maintained in Chicago were dissolving rapidly in the intimate atmosphere of the family villa, and Zara wasn't sure she had the strength to rebuild them before someone got hurt. Zara woke to sunlight streaming through the French doors and the distant sound of Sophia's laughter drifting up from the gardens below. For a moment, she lay still in the enormous bed, letting herself appreciate the luxury of waking naturally instead of to an alarm clock. The silk sheets felt impossibly soft against her skin, and the Mediterranean breeze carried the scent of jasmine and sea salt through the open windows. She'd slept better than she had in months, which was ironic considering how complicated her situation had become in less than 24 hours. Maybe it was the distance from Chicago and all its stressful responsibilities, or maybe it was the way Vincent had looked at her last night, like she was something precious rather than convenient. Either way, she felt more rested than she had since taking the position with the Torino family. After showering in the marble bathroom that was larger than her childhood bedroom, Zara dressed in a simple sundress and sandals, clothes that felt appropriate for exploring the villa grounds with Sophia. She found them in the terraced gardens behind the house, Sophia chattering excitedly in Italian, while Vincent listened with the patient attention of a father who understood that his daughter's happiness was worth any amount of botanical education. Vincent had changed into khaki pants and a white linen shirt with the sleeves rolled up, clothes that should have looked casual but somehow made him appear even more attractive than his expensive suits. The Mediterranean sun brought out golden highlights in his dark hair, and the relaxed atmosphere of the family villa had softened the controlled intensity he wore like armor in Chicago. "Zara, come see," Sophia called in English, bouncing on her toes with excitement. "Papa says these lemon trees are older than Nana Isabella. And look how big the lemons are. And there's a secret path down to a private beach that nobody else knows about." Vincent's eyes met Zara's over Sophia's head, and she saw amusement there mixed with something warmer that made her pulse quicken. He looked like a man on vacation rather than a powerful businessman with dangerous secrets, and the transformation was both appealing and unsettling. "Your daughter is an excellent tour guide," Zara said, accepting the lemon Sophia thrust into her hands with appropriate admiration. "And these gardens are incredible. How long has your family owned this property?" "5 generations," Vincent replied, falling into step beside them as Sophia skipped ahead to examine a fountain decorated with ancient Greek figures. "My great-great-grandfather bought it from a nobleman who'd lost everything gambling in Monte Carlo. It's been our refuge ever since, the place we come when the rest of the world gets too complicated." There was something in his tone that suggested the world had been quite complicated lately, and Zara found herself wondering about the business pressures he'd mentioned on the plane. She knew enough about the Torino family reputation to understand that Vincent's legitimate businesses were probably only part of his concerns, but she'd never asked for details about the parts of his life that existed in gray areas. Sophia had discovered a stone bench beneath an ancient olive tree and was settling herself with the Italian children's book she'd brought from Chicago. Without thinking, Zara sat beside her and opened to the page Sophia indicated, beginning to read aloud in fluent Italian with the kind of accent that came from formal study rather than heritage. Vincent stopped walking entirely, his expression shifting to something like surprise as he listened to Zara navigate the musical cadences of his native language with confident ease. She was so focused on Sophia's delighted reactions to the story that she didn't notice his attention until she looked up to find him watching them with an intensity that made her self-conscious. "You speak Italian beautifully," he said when the story concluded and Sophia had wandered off to chase a butterfly through the rose bushes. "I knew you helped Sophia with her pronunciation, but that was university-level fluency." Zara felt heat rise in her cheeks, though she wasn't sure why discussing her education should feel so personal. "I majored in international studies and linguistics at Northwestern before my circumstances changed," she explained. "Italian was my strongest language, followed by Spanish and French. I was planning to work for the State Department or maybe the United Nations." Vincent studied her with the kind of focused attention that made her hyper-aware of how much he was learning about her in this moment. "What would you have specialized in?" he asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "International conflict resolution," Zara admitted, then laughed softly at the irony. "I wanted to help negotiate peace between groups that seemed unable to coexist. I thought diplomacy and cultural understanding could solve most problems if people just tried hard enough." "And now?" Vincent asked, something careful in his tone that suggested he understood the weight of abandoned dreams. "Now I know that some problems are more complicated than good intentions and cultural sensitivity can fix," Zara said honestly. "But I still believe understanding different perspectives is valuable, even when solutions aren't simple." Vincent was quiet for a moment, watching Sophia attempt to climb onto the fountain's edge to get closer to the carved dolphins. When he spoke again, his voice carried an odd tension that made Zara look at him more closely. "Understanding different perspectives is essential in my world too," he said. "The legitimate businesses I run require constant negotiation between conflicting interests, and the other aspects of my work demand even more careful navigation of complicated relationships." Before Zara could ask what he meant by other aspects, Vincent's phone began ringing with the harsh insistence that suggested business rather than family. His expression immediately shifted to the controlled mask she recognized from his Chicago office. All warm vacation father disappearing behind the focused intensity of a man dealing with serious problems. "I need to take this," he said, already moving toward the house with long strides. "Watch Sophia for a minute?" Zara nodded, but something about his sudden tension made her uncomfortable. She'd learned to read Vincent's moods over the past 18 months, and this wasn't ordinary business stress. This was the kind of alert wariness that suggested actual danger, and she found herself straining to hear fragments of his phone conversation as he paced the terrace above them. She caught only pieces in rapid Italian, but the words she understood made her stomach clench with anxiety. Something about territories and disrespect and consequences. Vincent's voice was calm, but carried an underlying threat that reminded her forcefully that whatever else he was also a man other dangerous men took very seriously. When he returned 15 minutes later, his expression was carefully neutral, but Zara could see the tension in his shoulders and the way his jaw was set. Sophia was still absorbed in her exploration of the fountain, giving them a moment of relative privacy that Vincent seemed to need. "Everything all right?" Zara asked carefully, unsure whether he'd welcome her concern or consider it overstepping. Vincent studied her for a long moment, and she could see him making some kind of decision about how much truth to share. When he spoke, his voice was honest in a way that surprised her. "There are some business conflicts happening in Chicago that require my attention," he said. "Nothing that affects this trip or Sophia's safety, but it's a reminder that my world has complications most people don't have to consider." Zara felt her pulse quicken with something that might have been fear or might have been unwanted excitement. "What kind of complications?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew. Vincent's green-gray eyes searched her face, as if he was trying to determine whether she really wanted to know or was simply being polite. "The complications that come from running businesses that operate in gray areas," he said finally. "I have interests that put me in contact with people who solve problems in ways most citizens would find disturbing." The honest admission hung between them like a challenge. Vincent was giving her the opportunity to acknowledge what she'd probably always suspected about his activities, to decide whether she could accept the reality of who he was rather than the careful fiction they'd maintained in Chicago. "Organized crime," Zara said quietly, not a question but a statement that needed to be spoken aloud. "Among other things," Vincent confirmed, his voice steady but watchful. "I have codes I follow, lines I don't cross, especially when it comes to protecting innocent people. But I won't pretend that my business dealings are all legitimate or that the people I work with share my moral boundaries." Zara absorbed this information, trying to reconcile the man who defended her against his mother's disapproval with someone who admitted to criminal activities. The logical part of her mind was screaming warnings about getting involved with dangerous people, but another part of her was remembering how safe she'd felt when Vincent had positioned himself protectively between her and Isabella's hostility. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because Sophia chose you, and I'm beginning to understand why," Vincent said, his voice carrying weight that made her breath catch. "Because you're going to be in our lives for the next month, and you deserve to make informed decisions about what that means. And because I think you're strong enough to handle the truth." Before Zara could respond to that loaded statement, Sophia's voice cut through the tension between them with the particular note that meant something was wrong. "Papa, why is that man taking pictures of our house?" Vincent's entire body went rigid, his head snapping toward the direction Sophia was pointing. Zara followed his gaze to see a figure with a telephoto lens partially hidden behind the olive trees that bordered the property. The man was too far away to see clearly, but his presence was obviously unauthorized and unwelcome. "Sophia," Vincent said, his voice carefully controlled but underlaid with steel, "come here right now, sweetheart." The little girl heard the command in his tone and came immediately, pressing close to Vincent's side with the instinctive understanding that something dangerous was happening. Vincent pulled out his phone and made a quick call in rapid Italian, his words too fast and angry for Zara to follow completely, but she caught enough to understand he was calling for security. Inside, he told them both, his hands settling protectively on Sophia's shoulder as he guided them toward the house. The photographer melted back into the olive grove as they moved, but Vincent's tension remained coiled and ready until they were safely within the villa's stone walls. Isabella appeared in the foyer as they entered, her expression sharp with concern that suggested she'd received her own phone call about the security breach. She spoke quickly to Vincent in Italian, then turned to Sophia with a forced smile. "Why don't you help me prepare lunch, little one?" she suggested. "I have fresh pasta that needs careful stirring, and only someone with very gentle hands can do it properly." Sophia looked uncertainly between her grandmother and her father, clearly sensing the undercurrents of tension but not understanding their source. Vincent kissed the top of her head and assured her everything was fine, that he just needed to handle some business, and she should enjoy cooking with Nana. Once Sophia was safely in the kitchen with Isabella, Vincent's controlled facade cracked slightly, revealing the cold fury beneath his calm exterior. Zara had never seen him truly angry before, and the transformation was both frightening and strangely compelling. "I need to make some calls," he said, already moving toward what she assumed was his office. "This property is supposed to be private, secure. The fact that someone got close enough to photograph the house means either my security team has gotten careless or someone is sending a message." "Vincent," Zara said, catching his arm before he could disappear into business mode entirely. "Is Sophia really safe here?" He stopped moving, his attention focusing completely on her with the kind of intensity that made her feel like the most important thing in his world. The hand that covered hers was warm and steady, despite the anger she could see burning in his eyes. "I would die before I let anyone hurt her," he said simply. "Or you. But yes, she's safe here. This is my family's stronghold, and we've had 2 centuries to perfect its defenses. Whoever took those pictures wanted to be seen, wanted me to know they'd been here. It's a message, not a direct threat." The casual way he included her in his protection sent heat racing through Zara's veins, even as the rational part of her mind was processing the implications of needing protection at all. She was falling for a man whose life included real danger, whose business interests put him in conflict with other dangerous people, whose world operated by rules she didn't understand. She should be terrified. Instead, she felt safer than she had in months. 2 hours later, Vincent found Zara reading on the terrace while Sophia napped, her afternoon exploration having exhausted the little girl's energy reserves. He looked more relaxed than he had since the photographer incident, suggesting his phone calls had resolved whatever immediate concerns the intrusion had created. "Security issue handled?" Zara asked, looking up from her book as he settled into the chair beside her. "For now," Vincent confirmed. "It was exactly what I thought. A reminder from some business associates in Chicago that they know where to find me if negotiations don't go their way." Crude but effective. Zara studied his profile as he gazed out over the Mediterranean, noting the tension that still lingered in his jaw despite his casual tone. "Doesn't it worry you, having Sophia grow up around this kind of pressure?" Vincent was quiet for so long that Zara wondered if he was going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability she'd never heard before. "It terrifies me," he admitted. "Every day, I wonder if I'm being selfish by keeping her in my world instead of finding her a different life somewhere safe and normal. But she's all I have left of Maria, and I can't bear the thought of losing her too." The raw honesty in his confession made Zara's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. This was Vincent stripped of all his protective armor, just a father who loved his daughter desperately and feared he was failing her by being who he was. "Sophia doesn't need normal," Zara said gently. "She needs love and stability and people who make her feel secure. From what I've seen, you provide all of that in abundance. The rest is just circumstances." Vincent turned to look at her, his green-gray eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "You really believe that?" he asked. "Even knowing what you know about my business dealings?" "I believe that you're a good father and a good man who happens to work in a complicated world," Zara said, surprised by how much she meant it. "I've watched you with Sophia for 18 months, and I've seen how much thought you put into every decision that affects her welfare. That matters more than the specifics of how you earn your living." The silence that followed was charged with something deeper than gratitude or professional appreciation. Vincent was looking at her like she'd given him something precious, something he hadn't known he needed until she offered it. The afternoon sunlight brought out golden flecks in his eyes, and Zara found herself leaning slightly closer without conscious decision. "Zara," he said, her name carrying weight that had nothing to do with their employer-employee relationship and everything to do with the attraction that had been building between them since their conversation on the plane. She could see the exact moment he decided to cross whatever line he'd been maintaining, could see the shift in his expression from careful control to honest desire. His hand came up to cup her cheek, thumb stroking gently across her skin in a touch that sent electricity racing down her spine. "This is complicated," he said quietly, but he was leaning closer even as he spoke the warning. "Everything worthwhile is complicated," Zara whispered back, her own hand coming up to cover his where it rested against her face. They were inches apart now, close enough that she could see the darker ring around his irises, could feel the warmth of his breath against her lips. The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility and promise, until Sophia's voice calling for Zara from inside the house shattered the intimacy like breaking glass. Vincent stepped back immediately, his expression shifting to something like regret mixed with relief, and Zara felt the loss of his touch like a physical ache. They stared at each other for a heartbeat, both processing how close they'd come to crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed, before Sophia's calls became more insistent. "We should," Zara began, but Vincent was already nodding. "Yes," he agreed, though his eyes were still dark with unfulfilled desire. "We should go see what Sophia needs." But as they walked back toward the house together, Zara could feel the weight of what had almost happened between them, and she knew that whatever professional boundaries they'd been trying to maintain were dissolving faster than either of them was prepared to handle. The private beach was everything Sophia had promised, a crescent of golden sand accessible only through a steep path carved into the cliffs decades earlier by Vincent's grandfather. Ancient steps led down through wild rosemary and Mediterranean pine to a cove that felt completely isolated from the rest of the world, protected by rocky outcroppings on both sides and deep enough that the water stayed calm even when the sea beyond was choppy. Zara had initially planned to simply watch from the shade while Vincent and Sophia enjoyed their father-daughter beach time, but Sophia had different ideas about the division of responsibilities. "You have to come swimming with us," Sophia announced with the absolute certainty of a child who'd made up her mind. "Papa is good at the strong swimming, but you're better at the patient teaching kind. I want to learn to float on my back like the ladies in the movies." Vincent looked up from applying sunscreen to Sophia's shoulders, his expression amused, and something warmer as he took in Zara's modest one-piece swimsuit and the shy way she was hovering at the edge of their family activity. "You don't have to," he said, but there was invitation in his voice rather than dismissal. "Though I should warn you that Sophia has inherited her mother's determination about getting her way once she's decided on something." The mention of Maria felt natural rather than painful in this context, and Zara could see Sophia beam with pride at being compared to her mother in positive terms. It struck her that Vincent was learning to weave Maria's memory into Sophia's present in healthy ways, helping his daughter claim her inheritance of strength rather than just grief. "I'd love to help," Zara said honestly, and she was rewarded with Sophia's delighted squeal and Vincent's slow smile that did dangerous things to her pulse rate. The water was perfectly warm, heated by Sicily's summer sun to the temperature of a luxury spa. Sophia was a competent swimmer for her age, but wanted to master the more advanced skill of relaxing completely while floating, which required the kind of patient coaching that Vincent's protective instincts made difficult for him to provide. He was too worried about Sophia going under to let her experiment with the vulnerable feeling of surrender that floating demanded. Zara, however, had taught swimming lessons during her college summers to help pay for textbooks and could guide Sophia through the mental process of trusting the water to hold her weight. She started with simple exercises, having Sophia practice relaxing in progressively deeper water while Zara's hands provided security beneath her back and head. "Feel how the water wants to hold you up," Zara murmured as Sophia lay back against her supporting hands. "Your body knows how to float. You just have to stop fighting it and let it happen." From his position a few feet away, Vincent watched this process with an intensity that made Zara hyper-aware of how intimate it looked, how naturally she'd stepped into a maternal role that Sophia was accepting without question. When Sophia finally managed to float unsupported for 30 seconds, her triumphant shriek of joy was echoed by Vincent's proud laughter and enthusiastic applause. "Did you see, Papa? Did you see how long I floated?" Sophia demanded, paddling over to Vincent with strokes made clumsy by excitement. "Zara says I'm a natural, just like Mama was." Vincent's eyes met Zara's over Sophia's head, and she saw gratitude there mixed with something deeper that made her breath catch. "You're an excellent teacher," he said, his voice carrying warmth that had nothing to do with polite appreciation and everything to do with watching her nurture his daughter with genuine love. They spent 2 hours in the cove, swimming and exploring tide pools and building elaborate sand castles that Sophia insisted needed towers tall enough for princesses and moats deep enough for sea monsters. Vincent proved surprisingly skilled at architectural engineering for someone whose business involved more intimidation than construction, and Zara found herself relaxing into the kind of easy family dynamic she'd dreamed about but never experienced. The moment was so perfect that Zara almost forgot she wasn't actually part of this family, that she was staff who'd been temporarily elevated to friend status for Sophia's benefit. The reminder came with brutal efficiency when they returned to the villa to find Isabella waiting on the terrace with the kind of expression that suggested she had opinions about how her son was spending his vacation time. "Vincent," Isabella said in crisp Italian, switching to English only when it became clear he wasn't going to respond to her native language. "I need to speak with you about the estate manager's report. There are some decisions that require your immediate attention." Vincent's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Zara recognized the look he got when people were trying to manipulate him into conversations he didn't want to have. "Can it wait until after dinner, Mama?" he replied evenly. "Sophia and I were planning to explore the lemon groves this afternoon." Isabella's dark eyes shifted to Zara with barely concealed displeasure. "I'm sure your guest wouldn't mind entertaining herself for an hour while we handle family business. Perhaps she'd enjoy seeing the village or browsing the shops. There's a lovely little market that caters to tourists." The suggestion was delivered with such smooth politeness that it took Zara a moment to register the insult embedded in being dismissed as a tourist who needed shopping entertainment while the real family handled important matters. Vincent caught it immediately, his expression darkening with anger that he was clearly trying to control in front of Sophia. "Actually, Zara is part of our afternoon plans," he said, his voice carrying quiet authority that brooked no argument. "Whatever estate business you need to discuss can wait until this evening, after Sophia is in bed." Isabella's smile became sharper, but she inclined her head in apparent acceptance of her son's decision. "Of course," she said smoothly. "Family time is so important, especially when one has guests who may not understand our usual traditions." The emphasis on guests made Zara's stomach clench with discomfort, and she found herself wondering exactly how much of Isabella's hostility was about social class versus other factors that had nothing to do with her employment status. She'd encountered enough subtle racism in her life to recognize the particular edge in Isabella's voice that suggested disapproval went deeper than professional boundaries. Vincent seemed to sense her discomfort, because he moved closer to her in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. Sophia, completely oblivious to the undercurrents of tension, was already tugging on Zara's hand with enthusiasm about showing her the secret garden behind the lemon groves. The afternoon passed pleasantly, but Zara couldn't shake the feeling that Isabella was watching their interactions with calculating disapproval. Every time Vincent laughed at something Zara said, every moment when Sophia chose to hold Zara's hand instead of her father's, every casual touch or shared glance felt like it was being catalogued and judged by someone who'd already decided Zara didn't belong. The confrontation came 2 hours later, when Vincent had been called inside to handle a business call, and Sophia was napping off the exhaustion of her swimming lesson. Zara was reading in the garden pavilion when Isabella appeared with a tea service and the kind of gracious smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I thought we might have a little chat," Isabella said, settling herself in the chair across from Zara with the fluid elegance of a woman who'd spent decades commanding social situations. "Just the two of us, woman to woman." Zara's internal alarm bells started ringing immediately, but she closed her book and accepted the delicate porcelain teacup with polite gratitude. "Of course, Mrs. Torino. Is there something specific you wanted to discuss?" Isabella stirred her tea with silver spoon that probably cost more than Zara's monthly salary, taking her time before responding. "I've been thinking about your situation," she said finally. "It must be difficult, being so far from home, so far from your own people and familiar surroundings." The phrase "your own people" landed like a slap, delivered with such casual elegance that someone less experienced with coded language might have missed the racial undertone entirely. Zara felt her spine stiffen, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. "I'm grateful for the opportunity to travel with Sophia," Zara replied evenly. "She's a wonderful child, and seeing Sicily through her eyes has been a privilege." Isabella's smile sharpened slightly. Yes, Sophia has always been too trusting, too quick to form attachments to people who won't be permanent fixtures in her life. It's one of her more concerning traits, actually. She gets confused about appropriate boundaries, especially with staff members who encourage familiarity beyond their proper role. The criticism was delivered so smoothly that it took Zara a moment to process the multiple insults embedded in Isabella's words. Too trusting implied that Sophia's affection for Zara was misplaced. Won't be permanent was a clear reminder of Zara's temporary status. And the comment about encouraging inappropriate familiarity was both a professional criticism and a personal attack. I've always tried to maintain appropriate boundaries with Sophia, Zara said carefully. My goal is to provide whatever support she needs while respecting the family's expectations. Of course you have, dear, Isabella said, her tone so condescending that Zara had to grip her teacup to keep from setting it down too sharply. I'm sure you mean well. But intentions and outcomes aren't always the same thing, are they? Sometimes people in your position can lose sight of their place, especially when they're treated with more kindness than they're accustomed to receiving. The barely veiled threat in that statement made Zara's pulse spike with anger and something that might have been fear. Isabella was telling her, in the politest possible terms, that she was overstepping and needed to remember her place in the social hierarchy. The racial undertones were becoming less subtle with each carefully chosen phrase. I understand my position in this family, Zara said quietly, fighting to keep her voice steady. I'm here to help Sophia, and I have no intention of overstepping appropriate boundaries. Isabella leaned forward slightly, her dark eyes sharp with satisfaction at having drawn a defensive response. I'm glad to hear that, she said, because Vincent has always had a weakness for strays, for broken things that seem to need rescuing. It's a generous impulse, but not always wise, especially when it comes to raising a young girl who needs stability rather than temporary fixes. The word strays hit Zara like a physical blow, and she felt something crack inside her chest at the deliberate cruelty of the comparison. Isabella was reducing her to a charity case, something Vincent had picked up out of misplaced kindness rather than genuine appreciation for her worth. Sophia isn't a temporary fix for me, Zara said, her voice rougher than she'd intended. I care about her genuinely, not because I need rescuing or because your son pays my salary. Isabella's expression shifted to something like triumph, as if Zara had just proved whatever point she'd been trying to make. Caring isn't the same as belonging, dear, she said softly. And sometimes the kindest thing we can do is recognize when we don't fit, before we cause damage to people we claim to care about. Zara stood abruptly, her hands shaking with the effort to maintain composure in the face of such elegant cruelty. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, to point out that Sophia had specifically requested her presence and that Vincent had actively chosen to include her in their family time. But Isabella's words had found every insecurity Zara had been trying to ignore, every doubt about whether she belonged anywhere in Vincent's complicated world. Excuse me, Zara managed, her voice barely steady. I should check on Sophia. She escaped to her room before the tears could start, closing the door behind her with hands that trembled with suppressed emotion. Isabella's attack had been surgical in its precision, finding exactly the fears Zara had been carrying since childhood about not being wanted, not being worth keeping, not belonging anywhere she tried to make home. The rational part of her mind knew that Isabella's hostility was about control and prejudice rather than any actual failing on Zara's part. But the wounded part of her heart was remembering every time she'd been made to feel like an outsider, every moment when she'd been tolerated rather than truly welcomed, every relationship where she'd eventually worn out her welcome. She was sitting on the edge of the enormous bed, tears streaming down her face despite her best efforts to control them, when Vincent's voice came through the door. Zara? He called softly, concern clear in his tone. Sophia is looking for you. She wants to show you the shells she collected this morning. Zara wiped her eyes quickly and tried to compose herself, but when she opened the door, Vincent took one look at her face, and his expression shifted immediately to sharp concern and barely contained anger. What happened? He demanded, stepping into her room without invitation and closing the door behind him. Who upset you? The gentleness in his voice broke what remained of Zara's composure, and fresh tears spilled over despite her efforts to stay strong. She shook her head, unable to find words that wouldn't sound like complaints against his mother, unwilling to create family conflict because she couldn't handle some pointed criticism. Vincent moved closer, his hands coming up to frame her face with a tenderness that made her heart ache with longing for things she couldn't have. "Talk to me," he said quietly. "Please. I can see that you're hurt, and I need to know why." "Your mother thinks I don't know my place," Zara said finally, the words coming out in a rush before she could stop them. "She thinks I'm a stray you picked up out of misplaced kindness, that I'm getting too familiar with Sophia, that I don't belong in your family's world." Vincent's expression darkened with fury that transformed his features into something truly dangerous. "She said that to you?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet. "Not in those exact words," Zara admitted. "She was very polite about it, very elegant, but the message was clear." Vincent's hands were still framing her face, his thumbs stroking away tears with infinite gentleness, even as his eyes burned with protective rage. "I'm going to have words with my mother," he said, his voice carrying promise of consequences that would probably terrify Isabella despite her social confidence. "Please don't," Zara said quickly. "I don't want to cause problems between you and your family." Maybe she's right. Maybe I am overstepping, getting too attached to Sophia, forgetting that this is temporary. Vincent's expression shifted to something like pain, and his hands tightened slightly against her cheeks, as if he could hold her steady through sheer will. "Look at me," he said firmly. "Really look at me." Zara met his green-gray eyes and saw intensity there that took her breath away, certainty that seemed to burn away every doubt Isabella had planted in her mind. "You are not a stray," he said, each word precise and weighted with conviction. "You are not Charity. You are not temporary. You are the woman who gives my daughter peace, who makes her laugh, who helps her remember her mother with joy instead of only grief. You are the woman who makes me believe that maybe there's still room for happiness in our lives." The raw honesty in his voice made Zara's heart race with hope and terror in equal measure. Vincent was looking at her like she was precious, essential, like the thought of losing her was unbearable rather than inevitable. "Vincent," she whispered, his name carrying all the longing she'd been trying to suppress. "I called my personal physician in Chicago today," he said, his voice gentle but determined. "Dr. Morrison is one of the best oncologists in the country, and I've arranged for him to review your mother's case. He'll handle any follow-up care she needs, make sure she has access to the latest treatments, whatever gives her the best chance of staying healthy." Zara felt her breath catch with shock at the magnitude of what he was offering. Dr. Morrison was probably impossibly expensive, the kind of specialist who required connections and influence rather than just insurance coverage. "Vincent, I can't accept that," she said. "It's too much. I could never repay you for something like that." Vincent's smile was soft and determined. "You're not supposed to repay me," he said. "This isn't a loan or an obligation. This is me taking care of someone important to the woman who's become essential to my family's happiness." The word essential hit Zara like a revelation, and she saw in Vincent's eyes that he meant it exactly the way it sounded. Not useful, not convenient, not temporarily helpful, but truly essential. The kind of necessary that couldn't be replaced or substituted. "I don't understand," she whispered. Vincent's hands slid into her hair, cradling her head with infinite tenderness. "I think I'm falling in love with you," he said simply. "I think I've been falling since that first morning when Sophia announced she wanted you to come with us, since I watched you comfort her through nightmares I couldn't fix, since you looked at me yesterday and saw a good father instead of a dangerous man." The confession hung between them like a bridge Zara could choose to cross or burn, and she realized that Isabella's cruel words had forced her to confront feelings she'd been trying to deny since their first real conversation on the plane. Vincent wasn't looking at her like an employer or even like a friend. He was looking at her like a man who wanted to build something lasting with the woman he'd found himself unable to stop thinking about. "I think I'm falling in love with you too," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper but carrying enough conviction to make Vincent's eyes darken with desire and relief. He kissed her then, finally closing the distance that had been building between them for days. His lips were warm and firm against hers, the kiss starting gentle but deepening immediately as weeks of suppressed attraction finally found expression. Zara melted against him, her arms sliding around his neck as she kissed him back with desperate gratitude for this moment of perfect honesty. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard. Vincent rested his forehead against hers with the kind of intimacy that felt more profound than passion. "This changes everything," he said quietly. "I know," Zara replied, her hands still tangled in his dark hair. "Are you sure you want everything to change?" Vincent's smile was answer enough, but he spoke the words anyway. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." They were interrupted by Sophia's voice calling for Zara from the hallway, and they broke apart reluctantly, both processing the magnitude of what had just shifted between them. Vincent straightened Zara's dress with gentle hands, his touch still electric despite the practical nature of the gesture. "We should go see what Sophia needs," he said, though his eyes were still dark with unfulfilled desire. Zara nodded. But as they prepared to rejoin the innocent world of 80-year-old demands and family activities, she couldn't shake the feeling that Isabella's confrontation had accomplished exactly the opposite of what she'd intended. Instead of driving Zara away, it had forced both her and Vincent to acknowledge feelings that might have remained unspoken for much longer. When they found Sophia in the garden, examining a collection of smooth stones she'd gathered from the beach, she looked up with the uncomplicated joy of a child whose world felt secure and happy. "Zara, will you stay with us forever?" Sophia asked with the devastating directness that only children possessed. "I mean, not just for this trip, but always? You could live in our house and help Papa take care of me, and we could be a real family." Over Sophia's head, Zara met Vincent's eyes and saw her own hope reflected there, complicated by the knowledge that forever was a promise neither of them was ready to make, but both desperately wanted to believe in. The call came at 3 in the morning, jarring Zara from dreams filled with Vincent's hands in her hair and the promise in his eyes when he told her he was falling in love with her. The shrill ring of Vincent's phone cut through the villa's peaceful silence like a knife, followed immediately by his voice speaking rapid Italian in tones that made her stomach clench with anxiety even through the stone walls separating their rooms. She lay awake listening to the urgency in his voice, catching fragments that her sleepy brain struggled to translate, but understanding enough to know that something serious was happening in Chicago. Words like territory and bloodshed and immediate response filtered through her growing dread as Vincent paced what sounded like the length of his room while handling whatever crisis had exploded overnight. 20 minutes later, there was a soft knock on her door. Zara pulled on her robe and found Vincent standing in the hallway, fully dressed in the kind of dark suit he wore for serious business, his expression grim in a way that made her heart race with fear. "I have to go back to Chicago," he said without preamble, his voice carrying the controlled tension she recognized from his most difficult days at the mansion. "There's a situation that requires my immediate attention, something that can't be handled remotely or delegated to others." Zara felt her stomach drop as she processed the implications of his words. "How immediate?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew from the way he was dressed and the set of his jaw. "My plane leaves in 2 hours," Vincent replied. "This isn't something I can postpone or handle from a distance. People I'm responsible for are in danger, and my presence is the only thing that's going to resolve this without significant bloodshed." The casual mention of bloodshed sent ice racing through Zara's veins, a stark reminder that Vincent's world operated by rules she didn't understand and couldn't predict. "What about Sophia?" she asked. "What about the rest of your vacation?" Vincent's expression softened slightly as he looked at her, and she could see the regret in his eyes even as his voice remained steady and determined. "Sophia stays here with you," he said. "This property is completely secure. My mother will be here, and I'll have additional security in place before I leave. She's safer in Sicily than she would be anywhere near Chicago right now." Zara absorbed this information, trying to ignore the hurt that was spreading through her chest at being left behind, like a convenient babysitter, while Vincent handled the important aspects of his life. "And me?" she asked, hating how small her voice sounded. "Do I stay here too? Just waiting until it's safe for you to remember we exist?" Vincent moved closer, his hands coming up to frame her face with the same tenderness he'd shown the evening before. But there was something desperate in his touch now that suggested he knew exactly how this looked from her perspective. "You stay here because I need to know you're safe," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Because if something happened to you while I was dealing with this crisis, I'd lose my mind completely and make mistakes that would get people killed. I'm not leaving you behind, Zara. I'm protecting you." but it felt like being left behind, especially when Zara heard Isabella's voice drifting up from the foyer as she spoke to whoever had arrived to drive Vincent to the airport. The older woman's tone was sharp with satisfaction, and Zara caught enough Italian to understand that Isabella was pleased by this turn of events. This reminder of where Vincent's real priorities lay when crisis demanded action. Vincent kissed her forehead with infinite gentleness, a gesture that felt both like a promise and a goodbye. "I'll call you every day," he said. "This will be resolved quickly, and then I'll come back and we'll finish what we started here." Zara nodded because there was nothing else to do, but as she watched Vincent disappear down the hallway toward whatever transportation waited to take him back to his dangerous world, she felt something crack inside her chest. Less than 24 hours after telling her he was falling in love with her, Vincent had abandoned her at the first sign of trouble in his real life. The next morning, Isabella appeared in the breakfast room with the kind of gracious smile that didn't reach her eyes and a pot of coffee that probably cost more than Zara made in a week. "I thought you might appreciate some company," Isabella said, settling herself across from Zara with fluid elegance. "It must be difficult, being left behind while Vincent handles his actual responsibilities." The word "actual" hit like a deliberate slap, and Zara looked up from her untouched breakfast to find Isabella watching her with sharp satisfaction. "Now you see where you really fit in his priorities," the older woman continued smoothly. "When his real world calls, when the business that actually matters needs attention, romantic distractions get set aside quite easily." Zara felt heat rise in her cheeks at being dismissed as a romantic distraction, but Isabella wasn't finished delivering her message. "Vincent has always been prone to temporary infatuations," Isabella said, stirring her coffee with the kind of deliberate calm that suggested she was enjoying every word. "Usually with women who need rescuing, who make him feel powerful and generous. But when reality intrudes, when his actual life requires his attention, these diversions get forgotten quite quickly." Each word was chosen with surgical precision to find Zara's deepest insecurities about her worth and her place in Vincent's complicated life. Isabella was painting their connection as nothing more than a vacation fling, a brief distraction from Vincent's real priorities that would be easily discarded once he returned to Chicago and remembered who he actually was. Sophia appeared in the doorway, still in her pajamas and looking lost without her father's morning presence. "Where did Papa go?" she asked, climbing into the chair beside Zara with the unconscious trust that had developed over their months together. "He promised we would visit the village today and buy postcards to send to Chicago." Isabella's expression softened immediately for Sophia, but her eyes remained cold when they shifted back to Zara. "Papa had urgent business in Chicago," she explained to Sophia. "He'll be back when his work is finished, but that might be quite a while." The implication that Vincent might not return at all hung in the air like a threat, and Zara felt something inside her finally break under the weight of doubt and wounded pride. Isabella was right about one thing. When Vincent's real world had called, he'd left immediately without discussing alternatives or including Zara in the decision. She'd been relegated to caretaker status while he handled the important aspects of his life, exactly like the employee she'd been trying not to think of herself as. That afternoon, while Sophia napped and Isabella was occupied with estate business, Zara made a decision that felt both inevitable and devastating. She booked herself a commercial flight back to Chicago, leaving early the next morning while the villa would still be sleeping. She would return to her real life, to her mother's medical appointments and her modest apartment, and the careful boundaries she'd maintained before Vincent Torino had made her believe she could be something more than temporarily useful. She left a note for Sophia explaining that her mother needed her urgently, which wasn't entirely false since Zara desperately needed the comfort of familiar surroundings and unconditional love. She left a more formal note for Vincent, thanking him for the opportunity to travel and explaining that she'd realized the trip had blurred professional boundaries in ways that weren't healthy for anyone involved. The flight to Chicago was endless, cramped commercial travel that felt like penance after the luxury of Vincent's private jet. Zara spent 8 hours questioning every decision she'd made since Sophia had announced she wanted Zara to come to Sicily, wondering if Isabella was right about Vincent's capacity for temporary infatuation versus lasting commitment. She was collecting her luggage at O'Hare when she heard Vincent's voice calling her name across the terminal, desperate and furious and terrified in ways that made her heart race with confusion and unwanted hope. "Zara," Vincent called again, pushing through crowds of travelers with the kind of determined urgency that suggested he'd been moving at this pace since discovering she was gone. "Zara, stop. Please." She turned to find him approaching at nearly a run, still wearing the same dark suit from 2 days earlier, but now wrinkled and obviously slept in. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his jaw dark with stubble, and his green-gray eyes were wild with something that looked like panic. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, reaching her side and immediately checking her over as if searching for injuries. "Why did you leave? I told you I'd come back, that this would be resolved quickly." Zara felt tears threaten at the raw desperation in his voice, but she forced herself to stay strong against the part of her that wanted to fall into his arms and pretend Isabella's words hadn't found every insecurity she'd been trying to ignore. "You had important business to handle," she said, proud of how steady her voice sounded despite the way her heart was racing. "I realized that I was exactly what your mother said I was, a vacation distraction that doesn't belong in your real life." Vincent's expression shifted immediately to dangerous fury, and Zara caught a glimpse of the man other people feared when he was truly angry. "My mother said what to you?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet. "It doesn't matter what she said," Zara replied, adjusting her grip on her luggage and preparing to walk away from the most important relationship she'd ever had. "What matters is that she was right. When your actual life called, when people you're responsible for needed you, you left immediately. You didn't discuss it with me, didn't consider alternatives, didn't treat me like someone whose opinion mattered." Vincent moved closer, his hands coming up as if to touch her before stopping when he saw her step back. "I left because I needed you safe," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Because the situation in Chicago was dangerous enough that bringing you anywhere near it would have been criminal negligence on my part." "And that's exactly the problem," Zara said, surprised by how much anger was mixing with her hurt. "You made decisions about my safety and my life without consulting me, like I'm a child or a possession instead of a grown woman capable of understanding risk and making informed choices." Vincent stared at her for a moment, and she could see him processing her words, recognizing truths he probably hadn't considered in his urgency to protect her from his dangerous world. "You're right," he said finally, his voice carrying honest regret. "I should have discussed it with you. Should have explained the situation and let you make your own choice about staying or coming with me. I was so focused on keeping you safe that I forgot to treat you like a partner." The word partner hit Zara like a physical blow, everything she'd wanted to hear but was afraid to believe. Before she could respond, Vincent's expression shifted to alert tension, his attention focusing on something behind her with the kind of sharp awareness that meant danger. "Get behind me," he said quietly, his voice carrying absolute authority. Now, Zara turned to see 3 men approaching through the crowd, moving with purpose that had nothing to do with catching flights. They were dressed casually but carried themselves with the kind of controlled grace that suggested they were comfortable with violence, and their attention was fixed on Vincent with obvious hostile intent. Vincent stepped in front of Zara smoothly, his body language shifting to something predatory and dangerous that she'd never seen before. His hand moved inside his jacket with practiced efficiency, and suddenly Zara understood that he was armed and prepared to use whatever weapon he carried. The confrontation was brutal and brief. Vincent moved with lethal precision that spoke of years of training and experience, neutralizing the first attacker with efficient violence before the man could draw whatever weapon he'd been reaching for. The other 2 men found themselves facing someone who was clearly more dangerous than they'd anticipated, and within minutes the threat had been eliminated with decisive brutality that left Zara staring in shock. Airport security appeared immediately, but Vincent was already speaking in low, urgent tones to someone on his phone, and whatever he said resulted in the kind of rapid response that suggested he had connections throughout Chicago's power structure. The scene was controlled and cleared with efficiency that impressed even Zara, who was still processing what she'd witnessed. 20 minutes later, they were sitting in Vincent's car in the airport parking garage while he explained what had just happened in terms that made Zara's blood run cold. "The crisis in Chicago was a territorial dispute that escalated while I was in Sicily," he said, his voice steady but his hands shaking slightly as he checked her over for any sign of injury. A rival organization decided to test my resolve by threatening my businesses and the people under my protection. My presence was necessary to resolve the situation definitively. And those men? Zara asked, though she suspected she already knew. They were sent to grab you as leverage against me, Vincent replied, his expression darkening with fury that wasn't directed at her. Someone had been watching the airport, waiting for an opportunity to use you against me. If you hadn't been here, if I hadn't arrived when I did. He didn't finish the sentence, but Zara could see the terror in his eyes at what might have happened if those men had succeeded in taking her. The realization that she'd walked directly into danger by leaving Sicily, that Vincent's decision to leave her behind had actually been protection rather than abandonment, shifted everything she'd been thinking about their relationship. I would have died before letting them hurt you, Vincent said quietly, his voice carrying absolute conviction. But seeing them try, knowing that my world had reached out to threaten you, makes me wonder if my mother was right about one thing. Maybe caring about me does put you in danger you don't deserve. Zara looked at his profile as he stared out at the parking garage, seeing the self-doubt and fear that he was trying to hide behind his usual controlled facade. This was Vincent stripped of all his protective armor, terrified that loving her meant destroying her, questioning whether he had the right to ask her to accept the risks that came with his world. Vincent, she said softly, waiting until he met her eyes before continuing. I feel safest when you're protecting the people you love. What I saw in there wasn't frightening. It was you taking care of someone who matters to you. If that's part of who you are, if that's what comes with loving you, then I can handle it. Vincent stared at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression from fear to hope to desperate relief. You're not my employee anymore, he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. You haven't been since the moment you agreed to come to Sicily, maybe since the first time you held Sophia while she cried. You're my heart, Zara. You're the future I want to build, if you're brave enough to build it with me. The honesty in his voice made Zara's chest tight with overwhelming emotion, and she realized that this was her moment to choose. She could walk away now, return to her safe, predictable life, and always wonder what might have been. Or she could stay and accept everything that came with loving Vincent Torino, including the danger and the complications and the family members who would never approve. The choice was easier than she'd expected. I'm brave enough, she said simply, and Vincent's smile was brighter than the Sicily sun when he leaned across the car to kiss her with desperate gratitude and infinite promise. The confrontation with Isabella came exactly 12 hours after Vincent and Zara returned to Sicily. Once Sophia had been reunited with them in a tearful embrace that made it clear the little girl had been far more worried about their absence than anyone had realized. Vincent had spent the evening reassuring his daughter that both he and Zara were safe and wouldn't be leaving again, but his jaw had been set with determination that suggested other conversations were coming. Zara woke the next morning to the sound of Vincent's voice carrying through the villa's stone walls, speaking Italian in tones that were controlled but unmistakably furious. She couldn't make out specific words, but she didn't need translation to understand that he was having the discussion with his mother that had been building since Isabella's cruel comments about strays and appropriate boundaries. When Vincent appeared in the breakfast room an hour later, his expression was grim but satisfied, like a man who'd accomplished something unpleasant but necessary. Isabella was nowhere to be seen, though Zara could hear her speaking sharply to the household staff in rapid Italian that suggested she was taking out her frustration on safer targets. My mother understands her position going forward, Vincent said without preamble, settling beside Zara at the small table where she was sharing breakfast with Sophia. She will treat you with the respect due to someone I love, or she will find herself visiting this villa as a guest rather than living here as family. The quiet finality in his voice made Zara's breath catch with surprise at how definitively he'd chosen her over his mother's approval. Sophia looked up from her fruit with interest, clearly sensing important undercurrents but not understanding their full meaning. Is Nana Isabella sad about something? Sophia asked with the innocent concern of a child who noticed emotional tension but couldn't interpret its source. She seemed upset when I saw her in the hallway. Vincent's expression softened immediately for his daughter, his hand moving automatically to stroke her dark hair with infinite tenderness. Nana Isabella and I had a disagreement about how family treats each other, he explained gently. But it's resolved now, and everyone understands the rules going forward. Sophia nodded solemnly, processing this information with the serious consideration she gave to all adult explanations. Does this mean Zara is really part of our family now? She asked hopefully. Like, officially part of it instead of just visiting? Over Sophia's head, Vincent's eyes met Zara's with an intensity that made her heart race with anticipation and something that might have been nervous excitement. Actually, he said carefully, his voice carrying weight that suggested this conversation had been planned rather than spontaneous. I wanted to talk to both my girls about something important. Zara felt her breath catch at being included in that phrase. At the casual way Vincent claimed both her and Sophia as his girls, his family, his responsibility and joy. Sophia was bouncing slightly in her chair with excitement, clearly sensing that something significant was coming. Vincent reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small velvet box that made Zara's heart stop entirely. He set it on the table between them, not opening it, but letting its presence speak for his intentions before he found the words to match. Zara, Vincent said, his voice steady but his eyes showing vulnerability that reminded her he was taking an enormous emotional risk. I'm not asking you to marry me because it's expected or convenient, or because Sophia needs a mother figure. I'm asking because I can't imagine building a future without you in it. Because you've become essential to my happiness in ways that have nothing to do with what you do for my daughter. Sophia's squeal of delight was probably audible from the village, but Zara barely heard it over the thundering of her own pulse as she processed what Vincent was offering. Not just marriage, but partnership. Not just acceptance into his world, but genuine choice about what role she wanted to play in it. I'm asking you to choose me, Vincent continued, opening the box to reveal a ring that was elegant rather than ostentatious, clearly chosen for her taste rather than his ability to spend money. Because you want to, not because you feel obligated or grateful, or because leaving seems harder than staying. The emphasis on choice made Zara's throat tighten with emotion, because Vincent was giving her agency in a way that acknowledged everything that had gone wrong with his previous decision to leave her behind for her own protection. This wasn't him deciding what was best for her. This was him offering what he wanted and letting her determine whether she wanted it too. Sophia was vibrating with excitement in her chair, but her voice was small when she spoke. If you say yes, does that mean you'll really stay forever? She asked Zara. Like, you'll be my mama and help me remember stories about my first mama, and we'll be a real family? The hope in Sophia's voice was heartbreaking, and Zara realized that this decision wasn't just about her feelings for Vincent. Sophia had already chosen her as family, had been hoping for this exact outcome since the day she'd announced she wanted Zara to come to Sicily. This proposal was Vincent catching up to what his daughter had understood months earlier about where Zara belonged in their lives. Zara looked at Vincent's face, seeing love there mixed with nervous anticipation as he waited for her answer. She thought about Isabella's cruel words about not belonging, about the airplane ride where Vincent had opened up about his fears for Sophia, about the moment in the garden pavilion when he'd kissed her with desperate honesty about falling in love. Yes, she said simply, her voice steady despite the tears that were threatening to spill over with overwhelming joy. Yes to choosing you. Yes to building something permanent together. Yes to being Sophia's chosen mama and your partner in everything. Vincent's smile was brilliant as he slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit that suggested he'd been thinking about this proposal for longer than just the crisis-filled days in Chicago. Sophia launched herself into Zara's arms with enthusiasm that nearly knocked her off her chair, chattering excitedly about wedding dresses and flowers and whether they could have the ceremony in the villa's gardens. 3 months later, the same gardens were transformed into something magical for a ceremony that blended Vincent's Italian heritage with Zara's African-American traditions in ways that honored both cultures without diminishing either. White silk draped between ancient olive trees, strings of lights that would continue twinkling long after sunset, and flowers that carried the scents of both Mediterranean lavender and American roses. Zara's mother had made the trip to Sicily looking healthier than she had in years, the benefits of Dr. Morrison's specialized care evident in her energy and color. She'd taken to Vincent immediately, recognizing in him the same protective devotion to family that had driven all of Zara's best decisions. Watching her mother laugh with Isabella, who had apparently decided that accepting Zara gracefully was preferable to losing access to Sophia, felt like witnessing a small miracle of family diplomacy. Sophia served as flower girl with serious concentration, scattering rose petals with the kind of precision that suggested she understood the importance of her role in making this day perfect. She wore a dress that matched Zara's in color but age-appropriate style, looking every inch the beloved daughter she'd become officially as well as emotionally. Vincent had worked tirelessly over the past months to create a life that would give Zara genuine partnership rather than just elevated employee status. She'd been named co-director of the Torino Foundation, the charitable organization that managed the family's legitimate community investments, giving her meaningful work that utilized her education and passion for helping others. The foundation's offices were in the same building as Vincent's business headquarters, ensuring they could share lunch most days and never go more than a few hours without seeing each other. The wedding reception was held on the villa's main terrace, overlooking the Mediterranean under stars that seemed brighter than Zara remembered from her childhood. She found herself standing at the stone balustrade with Vincent during a brief, quiet moment between courses, both of them watching Sophia dance with Vincent's cousin Marco while musicians played traditional Italian folk songs. "No regrets?" Vincent asked quietly, his arm around her waist as they observed their combined families celebrating together with genuine warmth. "Only that we waited so long to stop pretending this wasn't inevitable," Zara replied honestly, leaning into his solid warmth with the kind of contentment that came from finally being exactly where she belonged. Sophia appeared at their side with the sudden materialization skills that 80-year-olds possessed, tugging on Zara's silk dress with careful fingers that suggested she'd been coached about being gentle with wedding attire. "Mama Zara," she said, the title that had developed naturally over the past months rolling off her tongue with comfortable ease. "Uncle Marco says he wants to teach me to dance the tarantella, but I told him I need to ask permission first." Zara felt her heart swell with pride at Sophia's thoughtfulness, at the way the little girl had learned to navigate having two mothers without feeling disloyal to either one. They'd spend hours talking about how loving Zara didn't mean forgetting Maria, how families could grow to include new people without displacing the importance of those who were gone. "Of course you can learn," Zara said, kneeling to Sophia's eye level despite her formal dress. "Your first mama would love knowing that you're learning dances from her homeland. Dancing is another way of carrying her memory with you." Sophia's smile was radiant as she skipped back toward the musicians, and Zara felt Vincent's hand tighten around hers with the kind of gratitude that spoke of witnessing something precious. "You're perfect with her," he murmured against her ear. "She's lucky to have you as her chosen mother, and I'm lucky to have you as my chosen partner in everything." The phrase chosen family resonated in ways that made Zara think about her audience back in Chicago, the people who might be listening to this story while navigating their own questions about belonging and permanence. Have you ever experienced the power of chosen family versus the family you were born into? Sometimes the people who choose to love you understand your heart better than those who are obligated to accept you. Tonight, watching Sophia confidently claim her as Mama Zara while dancing with relatives who had welcomed her without reservation, Zara understood that the most powerful families were built on choice rather than genetics. 6 months after the wedding, Zara stood in the nursery they'd created in the Chicago mansion, one hand resting on her growing belly while she watched Vincent assemble a crib with the kind of intense concentration he usually reserved for business negotiations. Sophia was sprawled on the carpet, carefully organizing baby clothes by color while offering running commentary about which outfits would be appropriate for different seasons. "This baby is so lucky," Sophia announced with the authority of someone who'd given considerable thought to the topic. "He's going to have the best papa and the best mama, and I'm going to teach him everything about being part of our family." Vincent looked up from the crib assembly instructions, his expression soft with the kind of happiness that had become his default since their wedding day. "How do you know the baby is a he?" he asked with amused curiosity. Sophia shrugged with 80-year-old logic. "I just know," she said confidently. "And I already picked out his name, if you want to hear it." Zara exchanged glances with Vincent over Sophia's head, both of them recognizing the serious tone that meant their daughter had been thinking about this decision with characteristic thoughtfulness. "We'd love to hear your suggestion," Zara said gently, settling into the rocking chair that had been Vincent's wedding gift to her, chosen specifically for the nursery they'd planned to fill together. "Antonio," Sophia said promptly. "Antonio Vincent Torino. Because Antonio means precious, and this baby is going to be precious to all of us. And Vincent because Papa should have a son with his name, and everyone will know he's part of our family." Vincent's expression shifted to something that might have been overwhelming emotion as he processed his daughter's thoughtfulness about including him in the naming decision while choosing something that honored the baby's anticipated importance to their family. "That's a beautiful name, sweetheart," Zara said, her voice slightly rough with hormonal tears that seemed to arrive without warning these days. "Antonio Vincent sounds perfect." Sophia beamed with satisfaction at having her suggestion accepted, then returned to her organization project with renewed enthusiasm. Vincent crossed to the rocking chair and kissed Zara's forehead with infinite tenderness, his hand joining hers on her still small belly. "A year ago, I thought my family was complete," he murmured against her hair. "I thought Sophia and I were doing fine on our own, that we didn't need anyone else to be happy. Now I can't imagine how empty our lives were before you chose to stay." Zara looked around the nursery they'd created together, at Sophia contentedly preparing for her baby brother's arrival, at Vincent whose happiness seemed to grow more solid every day they built this life together. A year ago, she'd been invisible in this same house, convinced she was temporary and replaceable. Tonight, she was exactly where she belonged, surrounded by people who'd chosen to love her as much as she'd chosen to love them. "Sometimes the most unexpected choices change everything," she said softly, echoing the sentiment that had started this entire journey. "Sometimes being chosen by the right people is all the belonging you ever needed." Outside the nursery windows, Chicago glittered with possibilities that felt as infinite as the love she'd found in the most unlikely place. Vincent was humming softly as he returned to assembling their son's crib. Sophia was planning elaborate big sister lessons, and Zara was finally completely home.